Many times we've seen cases where someone reaches a breaking point. But sometimes when it seems that this has happened, we need to dig a little deeper to see if there is a bigger picture than an otherwise ordinary person apparently losing the plot. And when we do, sometimes we see that the perpetrator is a truly malevolent and hateful person that believes the world is against them and needs to be taught a lesson. That's what we see in today's case. To all intents and purposes, we have a man who seems to have snapped and done something horrific. But a little investigating into that man's background reveals a man with numerous axes to grind and a massive chip on his shoulder. This is the case of the 1993 Long Island Railroad Massacre, and this is Murder of Crows. It is. It really is. Yeah.
Say that you're ready, but you won't like it. You say that you're ready, but you won't like it. Silence all the crows, lighten up in little rows. A sudden chill surrounds me. Silence all the crows, see come out and say you're wrong. A sudden chill.
For this case, we are going to focus on the timeline of the perpetrator to see if we can work out how this man was formed and how he became the simmering vessel of hatred and self-pity that committed the heinous actions of December the 7th, 1993. So with that in mind, we need to look at the life of Colin Ferguson. Colin Ferguson was born in Kingston, Jamaica on January the 14th, 1958. And he was one of 5 sons of Von Herman and May Ferguson. His father was a pharmacist and was managing director of Hercules Agencies. And Hercules was one of the largest wholesale drug companies in all of Jamaica. He had been born in Cuba, where his grandfather had worked in the German embassy 50 years ago. Colin's father was named after Hermann Göring, the Nazi air marshal. Now, inspiration for baby names can come from anywhere, but hindsight certainly give people a stick to beat him with. But anywho, the family lived in Havendale, which was an upper middle class suburb of Kingston. And it is a community that might strike many people as a tropical paradise. Large homes on palm-lined streets. And among these, the Ferguson home was typical, with servants that included a nanny and a housekeeper. Colin, as a child, led a sheltered and affluent life. He attended the Meadowbrook Prep School, and from 1969 to 1974 attended Calabar High School, which was one of Jamaica's most prestigious private all-boys schools. And it was founded in 1912 by British missionaries to serve the elite of Jamaican society. Joseph Earl was principal at the time that Colin Ferguson was there, and said that Colin was a pleasant, punctual, well-behaved student who played cricket, was the star goalkeeper on the soccer team, and graduated in the top third of his class. Friends from the time remembered him as fat, jovial, clownish, given to talk about sports and girls. Bit like me then, really. Anyway, he was a typical teenager with a childhood far removed from the poverty and deprivation we see in the backgrounds of many of the perpetrators of violent crime. So we're asking ourselves now, what went wrong? Well, bear with me, dear people, bear with me. After an idyllic upbringing, tragedy hit twice in quick succession in 1978 and 1979, when first his father died in a car accident, before his mother died a year later from natural causes, but no less of a blow to the family. The result of this was that the siblings lost their privileged life. I mean, far from a decline to the poverty line, it was nonetheless a big shift in their way of life, as money became more of an issue, alongside, of course, the loss of the anchors that their world had revolved around. The brothers, Herman, Richard, Winston, David, and of course Colin, were scattered to the four winds. Some moved to live with relatives or take jobs, but Colin, who was dissatisfied with his prospects in Jamaica, emigrated to the United States in September of 1982, when he would have been 24 years old. He landed in Miami on a visitor's visa and moved to Long Beach, California, where by 1984 he was working as a clerk at Eddie's Liquor and Junior Market Stores, which were a chain of liquor stores, as the name suggests. The owner said Colin Ferguson worked there for a year, but then quit without explanation. This owner recalled Colin as an articulate young man, but with a definite chip on his shoulder, disdainful of work that he considered to be beneath him, like sweeping up the parking lot. So there were already signs of a sense of entitlement. But there was also a tendency towards blaming many of his tribulations on racial undertones, though it is unclear why, other than perhaps Ferguson picking up on the societal tensions and seeing a viable scapegoat for everything he saw as a problem in his life. There were no other triggers for any racial feelings, I suppose. Ron Rickey was one of the security people for the liquor chain and remembered Colin Ferguson as a defensive loner, easily offended and often angry about racial matters. The security man said, "I was always uncomfortable going to whichever store he happened to be working in. It was his attitude, always very prejudiced, with a general hatred towards everyone, even some black people." By 1986, Colin Ferguson was 28 and had moved to Long Island in search of a better life. On May the 13th, he married Audrey Warren, and as she was a United States citizen, this entitled him to permanent residency in the country. Did he marry for love? We can't say, but the residency probably helped. The couple rented part of a home from a woman called Beverly Reed, and this was in Westbury, Long Island. And she recalled that the couple had a turbulent marriage that regularly required the involvement of the police. Good signs there. He had no set career or indeed any sort of settled employment. Instead, Colin Ferguson did odd jobs and from there bought a car and had some semblance of a normal life. In early 1987, he enrolled at Nassau Community College as a part-time student, taking accounting and business administration courses. But he once again revealed his aggressive levels of self-aggrandization when, after receiving a low grade in one course, he was also forced to leave another course after a disciplinary hearing found that he had been overly aggressive towards the teacher. So we are seeing a pattern of entitlement where everything is someone else's fault. No recipe for disaster here. Now, personal issues curtailed his academic career before the start of the next academic year. He did not continue in the 1988-89 school year because his marriage was, unsurprisingly, coming apart. Neighbours told of regular and persistent disputes between the couple, with Colin Ferguson moving out in late 1987 and then his wife winning an uncontested divorce in May of 1988. And this was another thing that Colin Ferguson took very personally, but at the same time would not take any personal responsibility for, because, you know, he's one of life's victims. Following this, we get yet more examples of Colin Ferguson not playing well with others. As when he took a basement apartment in Westbury with a male roommate, there were frequent fights between the roommates. Shortly after the finalisation of his divorce, Colin Ferguson got an office job with a manufacturer of burglar alarms and security systems. On August the 18th, 1989, while standing on a stool pulling invoices from a filing cabinet, Colin Ferguson slipped and fell, suffering injuries to his head, neck and back. He filed a claim for workers' compensation disability benefits, and after several hearings was awarded $75 a week. Unable to continue working at that job, he re-enrolled in the September at Nassau Community College to, prove to everyone how terribly clever he was. And in fact, for a time, that's exactly what he did. Because in the 1989-90 school year, his grades were good enough for him to make the Dean's List in the spring of 1990, meaning his grades averaged at least A-. At this time, Colin Ferguson was intelligent, but a school official said that while he was intelligent, he certainly had interpersonal relationship problems with this same official, then also rather ominously saying, he was not a person you would want to have a gun. Glowing praise there. Colin Ferguson transferred to Adelphi University in the autumn of 1990, where he majored in business administration. In that following school year, students and professors alike recalled that he seemed to be obsessed with racism, detecting slights where there were just innocent encounters, and raging against coexistence with whites. Again, my personal view, given that he had no direct encounters with actual incidents of racism as far as I could find, is that he tapped into the undercurrent of racism in society and perhaps saw it as an outlet for his misplaced rage and the need to blame someone or something for all of life's problems. In fact, it would be this obsession that would cut his academic career short. The issues seemed to at least begin to come to a head when he tried to shout down a professor who was giving a symposium on the sabbatical that she had had in South Africa, with Colin Ferguson shouting out, "We should be talking about the revolution in South Africa and how to get rid of the white people." And he said this with no context or explanation. At around this time, Colin Ferguson went to Dr. Makepela, who was the head of campus minority affairs, and complained that a white woman in a student library had shouted racial slurs at him. After the professor found that the claim was groundless, Colin Ferguson then turned on the professor, claiming that he was undermining blacks on campus. Not satisfied with that, he later threatened Dr. Macapela, and of course the professor recommended Colin Ferguson be suspended, and he was duly suspended in June of 1991. He would have been eligible to reapply for the following school year, but he did not do so. Instead, he chose to move to Brooklyn. And it would be in Brooklyn that there would be something of a final surrender to his rising bile and bitterness and rage would happen. He took a very small room at the rear of a house for $150 a month. It was only 6 feet wide and 10 feet long, with no television or pictures on the walls, and little but a single bed, a lamp, a nightstand, a radio, and various religious books. And the homeowner actually recalled Colin Ferguson as a very decent man, describing him as very respectful, saying he didn't talk much, just please and thank you. He apparently did not drink alcohol or smoke or take drugs. He jogged, went fishing at Sheepshead Bay, and paid his rent on time. He started doing odd jobs around the neighbourhood to supplement his disability checks. But all the while, his prickly nature and general unpleasantness was never far away. In February of 1992, Colin Ferguson was arrested at the Times Square subway station in Manhattan after a dispute with a white woman aboard a train. According to a statement by Colin Ferguson, the woman demanded that he move over to allow her to sit down, not an unreasonable request, and he said that he did so. But the transit police reported that he harassed, cursed, threatened and elbowed the woman, who summoned the police. And while this case never went to trial, Colin Ferguson nonetheless sent letters to the city's police commissioner and other high-ranking officials complaining that the arrest was vicious and racist. At this time, Ferguson was fighting another battle, but, well, like most of his battles, to be fair, it was one of his own making, and in this case was motivated by his own greed. In place of the small regular checks from the workers' compensation, he sought a large lump sum instead. After a series of hearings, the State Workers' Compensation Board in September 1992 approved a settlement in which he was awarded a total of $26,250, which would be very nearly $60,000 today. But less than 7 months later, Colin Ferguson moved to reopen the case, claiming that he was still having pain from the injury and seeking more money. Because of course he was, and since he now had a target for his entitlement and blame, and certainly one that could get him some money, it was at this time that his bitterness and anger at life and everyone and everything was actually starting to turn him into a parody of himself. Shortly after making this application, Colin Ferguson returned to Long Beach, California, where, rather ominously, he went to Turner's Outdoorsman, a gun shop in Signal Hill, and put down an $82 deposit on a $299 15-shot semi-automatic Ruger P89 pistol. He gave his real name, supplied a California driver's license, and used the motel he was staying at in California to prove his residency. He filled out a form affirming that he had no criminal record, and duly waited the necessary 16 days before returning, paying the balance due, and collecting the weapon. A bitter and entitled man carrying tendencies for racial profiling and blame now had a gun. What could possibly go wrong? In a very rare move, given his application for more money, the Workers' Compensation Board were actually prepared to look again at Colin Ferguson's case, which was incredibly surprising since closed cases were hardly ever reopened. But when Colin Ferguson refused to go to a medical professional for a re-evaluation of his medical condition, his application was then denied. Whether this was the final straw for Colin Ferguson was debatable. But speaking after the horrific incident that would come later, his landlord noticed that the previously ebullient Ferguson went very quiet, with him saying, I think in the last 2 weeks, before the incident he's referring to, in the last 2 weeks he was deciding what he was going to do. I guess he wanted to make sure his fury level was at a peak. He got very quiet, incredibly quiet. He didn't play his radio, and he stopped praying for the first time in a very long time. This kind of alarmed me, and we did ask him to leave, because I got the feeling I just couldn't reason with him anymore. I got the feeling that one day I was going to walk in and his door would be half open, and I might see him swinging on a rope. Instead of taking that particular path, Ferguson loaded his newly bought 9mm pistol, put 160 rounds of additional ammunition into his pockets, and left his room for the last time at about 4 p.m. on that Tuesday. He went to Pennsylvania Station and boarded the 5:33 train to Hicksville, which was a 12-car train crowded with commuters. He sat in the rear of the third car, just another heavy-set man in a tan windbreaker, hardly remarkable among the rows of people who were reading newspapers or dozing off on their way back home. As the train approached Garden City, he made his move. With the train approaching the station, Ferguson drew the gun, dropped several cartridges on the ground, stood up, and opened fire at random. During the next 3 minutes, he killed 6 people and injured another 19. Some passengers mistook the gunshots for caps or fireworks until a woman shouted, "He's got a gun. He's shooting people." Ferguson walked forward on the train, pulling the trigger steadily about every half a second. Several passengers tried to hide beneath their seats, while others fled to the eastern end of the train and tried to enter the next train car. Ferguson walked down the aisle of the train and shot people to his right and left as he passed each seat, briefly facing each victim before firing. After the fact, his actions were described as being as methodical as if he were taking tickets. Ferguson apparently said, "I'm going to get you," over and over as he walked down the aisle of the train. Other passengers further away in the train did not realize that a shooting had occurred until the train stopped, as a crowd of panicked passengers fled from the third car into neighboring cars. One man appeared annoyed by their unruliness and said, "Be calm," before they forced a train door open and fled into the station. 2 people were injured in the stampede of passengers. The train's conductor was informed of the shooting, but he, in his infinite wisdom, decided against opening the train doors right away, because 2 of the cars were not yet at the platform. Gotta love yourself a job's worth, haven't you? An announcement was made ordering conductors not to open the doors. But engineer Thomas Silhan climbed out of the window of his cab and opened each door from the outside so that panicked passengers could escape. And his actions could well have saved many people from a very different fate. By this time, Ferguson had emptied 2 15-round magazines during his shooting spree. While he was reloading his 3rd magazine, somebody yelled out, "Grab him!" Passengers Michael O'Connor, Kevin Bloom, and Mark McEntee tackled him and pinned him to one of the train's seats. Several other passengers ran forward to grab his arms and legs and helped to pin him across a 3-seat row, with his head towards the window and legs towards the aisle. While he was pinned down, obviously, Colin Ferguson said, "Oh God, what did I do? What did I do? I deserve whatever I get." He also repeatedly pleaded with those holding on to him, saying, "Don't shoot me. I'm sorry. I'm sorry." 5 to 6 people continued to hold him pinned down for several minutes while they awaited some kind of relief or support. Andrew Roderick, an off-duty Long Island Railroad police officer who was picking his wife up from the train, then boarded the train and handcuffed Colin Ferguson. Of the people who were killed, 5 died on the day of the shooting, while the 6th died 5 days later in hospital. The deceased victims ranged in ages from 24 to 52. And those victims were Maria Magtoto, who was 30, James Goriecki, who was 51, Amy Federici, who was 27, Mi Kyung Kim, who was 27, Dennis McCarthy, who was 52, and Richard Nettleton, who was 24.
From ABC, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings.
Good evening. We're going to begin tonight with random terror and its after effects. When a single individual pulled out a handgun last night and began to kill people on a commuter train making its way out of New York City, this city certainly gasped and said, "Not again." And in other parts of the country, when people heard that 5 had been murdered and 20 others injured on the train, a very broad reaction seemed to be, is any place safe in this day and age? He was quite methodical. He killed, he reloaded, and he killed again. Our first report is from ABC's Karen Burns.
It was rage unleashed. Commuters bound for home, targeted by a man exploding with racial hatred. A man who deliberately selected a captive crowd of affluent, upper-middle-class people to become his victims.
I was in the 3rd car of the train with the shooter. I heard popping noises, and I don't know what instinct told me this was the real thing, because I almost immediately ducked down behind my seat and as close to the floor as I could get.
As the train slowed, 3 passengers managed to subdue the gunman. When the train arrived at the next stop, passengers were piled atop one another, bleeding and in shock. The gunman was taken away, and this morning police tried to shed some light on his motive.
Paperwork reveals strong hostility being harbored by him in terms of racism.
Police say the suspect, Colin Ferguson, is a native of Kingston, Jamaica. He apparently had pages of notes in his pocket as he went on his shooting spree. They were filled with angry references to whites, Asians, and Uncle Tom blacks. Police searched his room in a boarding house in Brooklyn this morning and found piles of paper, the contents of which have not been revealed. According to law enforcement sources, Ferguson may have planned this attack as early as spring when he went out to California and purchased a 9mm semi-automatic weapon capable of firing up to 15 rounds.
He came in on May the 9th of 93, paid the balance of his account on the firearm layaway agreement and picked up the firearm.
Ferguson gave the shop a Long Beach, California address, which turned out to be this motel, where, according to the manager, Ferguson stayed from April 22nd to May 12th, just over the 15-day waiting period required to purchase a gun in California. Police say Colin Ferguson does not have a criminal record. By all accounts, Colin Ferguson was a drifter, a loner. In the end, he might never have been noticed had it not been for his trip on the 5:33 train to Hicksville. Karen Burns, ABC News, New York.
At the White House today, President Clinton called yesterday's killing a terrible human tragedy. It underlines the need, he said, for Congress to pass a comprehensive crime bill, one that would put more police on the streets and limit the sale of assault weapons.
There are a lot of things that we're going to have to do in this country to get violence under control that relate to rebuilding our communities and healing across racial lines and economic lines. But we need to start with public safety.
Just 2 weeks ago, President Clinton signed into law the first national legislation to regulate the sale of handguns in many years, the Brady Law, which requires handgun buyers to wait 5 days for a background check.
Ferguson's incarceration before trial, and indeed the trial itself, were the focus of intense media attention. Shortly after his incarceration began, Ferguson, obviously, as we know the man now, complained about his treatment, claiming the corrections officers attacked him with milk crates and with a fire extinguisher, while depriving him of necessities like soap and antiperspirant spray. Oh, bless. Ferguson said at the time, "Of course, there is no sympathy for me in the institution. When I suffered and screamed, I was told that it was a good sign by the prison guards, because they were hoping for my swift departure from life." On March the 23rd, 1994, while returning to his cell from the medical unit, Ferguson was attacked in jail by a group of inmates. Ferguson suffered a broken nose and a swollen left eye. It was just before this incident on the 1st of March 1994 that William Kunstler and Ron Kuby, who were law partners well known for representing unpopular clients, announced that they had accepted a request by Ferguson to handle his case. And Kunstler went on to say that he would not collect a fee for the defense, and also said that Colin Ferguson had been made out to be a pariah by the media and by the public. And it would be Kunstler and Kuby that would propose an interesting defense for the horrific incident on the train. This defense was that Ferguson had been driven to temporary insanity by a psychiatric condition that they termed black rage. Kunstler and Kuby argued that Ferguson had been driven insane by racial prejudice and could not be held criminally liable for his actions, even though he had undoubtedly committed the killings. The attorneys compared it to the utilization of the battered women defense, or post-traumatic stress disorder and the child abuse syndrome in other cases to negate criminal liability. Now, black rage was a phenomenon first proposed by psychologists William Henry Greer and Price Cobbs in their 1968 book entitled Black Rage. Greer and Cobbs made an argument that black people living in a racist, white supremacist society are psychologically damaged by the effects of racist oppression. They argue that this damage causes black people to act abnormally in certain situations. It was certainly an innovative strategy, but would at some level require that Ferguson was not competent. And this assertion would drive a wedge between Ferguson and his attorneys. So against the idea of pleading not fit to stand trial was Ferguson that he dismissed his attorneys and decided to represent himself. As you do. This move turned an already high-profile case into a media sideshow. During the course of his cross-examinations, Ferguson would refer to himself in the third person, particularly asking the victims of the shooting, "Did you see Colin Ferguson?" To which the witness would sensibly reply, "I saw you shoot me."
The evidence will show that Colin Ferguson was in fact a well-meaning passenger on the train, and also a well-meaning passenger transporting to Safe Haven a firearm, which in fact he purchased legally. At the time that Mr. Ferguson was on the train, like any other passenger, he dozed off, having the weapon in a bag. At that point, someone opened the bag, took the weapon out of the bag, and proceeded to shoot. I expect that after you have deliberated and carefully weighed the evidence in this case, you will return the only possible verdict. That is a verdict of not guilty. I thank you very much. Would you say the description you gave of 5'10", 5'11" inches, tall, stocky build, short hair, in his 30s could fit just about any person?
Yes. Sustained.
It was your statement that you play dead?
Yes.
And did that involve closing your eyes?
Yes, it did.
So you wanted the person who was doing the shooting to think that you were dead?
Yes, I didn't want you to shoot me again.
So you were not able to see anything, am I correct? Because your eyes were closed.
After being shot, I saw you shoot me.
Sounds.
So I thought that some kids had thrown firecrackers into the train.
I saw the shooter walking up the aisle towards me, looking into seats with his right hand extended.
He looked me in the eyes, square in the face. I'm looking at you right now. And he pointed his gun at me.
He had the gun pointed at me. He then opened fire on me.
A bullet entered my left hand across the palm, came through my left thumb, shattering the thumb, entered my neck, and proceeded up into my mouth where it lodged in my tongue. I just kind of was frantic, and I stated, I have 7 children. I can't die in this train.
He shot me 5 times. I was bleeding pretty bad from both my arms, and they tied tourniquets on my arms to try and slow the blood down?
I was shot in the forehead.
The bullet, when it entered me and it went off my rib.
I felt a bullet hit me in the left buttock area.
Well, I was shot 2 times or 3 times. I didn't know really how many at the time, but things go through your head, you know. You just had the sweats and burning and sort of like that. I just didn't know. I mean, you get shot with a gun, I thought, chances are you don't make it.
I had an entrance and an exit wound to my right shoulder.
There was a gentleman by the window who was unconscious at that point. That was Jim Garicki.
I saw another man get shot, I think, in these seats here. There was blood all over the window. His head had basically exploded onto the window.
Robert Giuliano and Lisa Gambatti both say they are haunted by Maria Magtoto's death.
Back of her head or her head, it exploded. I saw her on the floor in front of me, blood all over.
That was a vision that haunted me for weeks and weeks. Just at what a beautiful face she was, and I just knew that she was dead.
When I went home that night, I told my wife, after I saw it, this beautiful girl with an angelic face came on the train, and 2 minutes later, she was dead at my feet. Her blood was on my pants.
Did you lose part of your brain cells?
Yes, I lost an estimated 10% of my brain.
What about your skull?
A portion of my skull was replaced by a titanium mesh plate.
Do you recognize that person who saw the shooting in courtroom today?
Yes, I do.
He's the gentleman in the brown jacket at the second table.
Well, he's the fellow with the brown jacket and a brown tie.
That individual right there.
Be more specific.
There are 2 individuals sitting at the table behind Detective Parpan. It's the one on the left with the brown suit on.
The gentleman sitting at the defense table in the center, brown jacket.
Mr. Ferguson.
Did there come a time when you heard a pop?
Yeah, when you got up out of your
Judge,
seat,
who did you see shot first?
I saw you shoot someone to the north side of the train, which is your left.
Is it your testimony under Mr. Peck's questioning that you saw no one shot?
I saw you shooting everyone on the train, okay?
Legal experts pointed out that Ferguson's questions were pointless and were not geared towards rebutting testimony. By not recognizing when to object to testimony and closing argument, he lost his right to appeal on those grounds. Among the defense witnesses that Ferguson requested was then President Bill Clinton. Obviously. Ferguson originally sought to question himself on the witness stand, but ultimately did not do so. Can't think why. He told the judge and media that he intended to call a number of witnesses who would prove his innocence, including a ballistics expert, a handwriting expert, and 2 regular eyewitnesses. But they were afraid to come forward and take the stand. Ultimately, he did not call any of the witnesses. Oh, it's a shame. President Clinton had already made the journey. He also told Judge Belfi of an alleged conspiracy by the Jewish Defense League to kill him in prison if he was convicted. He went on to say that the prison slaying of serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer was set up as a prelude against me. Well, awful lot going on in there. His actions on the train made him a cockwomble, but his trial and his antics served only to reinforce his cockwombleness. I don't know if that was a word, but it is now.
Ferguson showed no mercy, and he should receive no mercy. That is the emotional message survivors and relatives of victims of the 1993 shooting rampage on a Long Island, New York railroad train. Ferguson has been convicted of 6 counts of murder and 19 counts of attempted murder. Today, the sentencing hearing began. Person after person maintained Ferguson deserves the maximum sentence possible.
I was convicted and sentenced by a depraved madman with an assault gun. I would ask that this criminal receive no special treatment, that he be treated as any other common criminal, perhaps being placed with his own kind, cause him to reflect on his actions and the pain and suffering he has caused so many.
I will never understand for the rest of my life why you, Colin Ferguson, murdered my husband as well as the other 5 victims and injured 19 people. Dear Honor, may you put him away forever in prison, no parole, ever.
During the trial, I noticed how quickly you turned away from the autopsy photos of the people you murdered. I think this perfectly illustrates why you're such an absolute coward. And it's why I'm not expecting you to ever feel anything for the people you murdered and the lives you ruined, because you refuse to see the world through the eyes of anyone other than yourself.
I know I have an impossible request, Your Honor, but given 5 minutes alone with Colin Ferguson, this coward would know the meaning of suffering. I plead with the court to impose the maximum sentence without parole. And I have the utmost faith in the judicial system. Unfortunately, I had to be a victim to experience it. Thank you, Your Honor.
You remember these eyes. You're nothing but a piece of God. You're a goddamn animal. 5 minutes, that's all I need with you. 5 minutes.
Ferguson is expected to be sentenced tomorrow. He faces 25 years to life on each of the murder counts.
Ferguson was convicted on February the 17th, 1995 of the murder of the 6 passengers who died of their injuries. He was also convicted of attempted murder for wounding 19 passengers. He received 315 years and 8 months to life, meaning his current earliest possible parole date is August the 6th, 2309. Get your diary out, Colin. The judge said Colin Ferguson will never return to society and will spend the rest of his natural life in prison. At the sentencing, Judge Donald E. Belfie called Ferguson, I don't know where he got this idea, he called Ferguson a selfish, self-righteous coward. Many African Americans expressed concern that the Long Island Railroad, or LIRR, shooting would lead to a backlash of violence and racial animosities against the black community. Civil rights activists Al Sharpton and Herbert Daughtry urged that African Americans in general not be blamed for the crime. Sharpton in particular criticized what he called attempts to demonize black and Hispanic dissatisfaction by linking those groups to the murders. Civil rights activist Jesse Jackson delivered a sermon at the Cathedral of the Incarnation in Garden City, and during a service attended by the victims' grieving families, he stressed that the shootings were the result of one man and should not be seen as indicative of all African Americans. Perhaps the most notable other outcome of the shootings, and a silver lining of sorts, if there can be one, was that Carolyn McCarthy, whose husband Dennis McCarthy was killed by Ferguson, and whose son Kevin McCarthy was severely injured, was subsequently elected to the United States Congress on a platform of gun control. And she was motivated to run for Congress after the incumbent representative in her district, Dan Fraser, voted against an assault weapons bill. Some of Ferguson's other victims and their family members also became heavily involved in gun control efforts. One strange and poignant and odd point of note, I guess, is that the train car that became a massacre scene when Colin Ferguson killed 6 people and wounded 19 more is actually still in service some 30 years later. It provides daily rides to hundreds of commuters. Some riders have posted on social media that travelling in the ill-fated train car is creepy. But Long Island Railroad spokesman Aaron Donovan said that the decision to retain the car among its fleet was not made lightly. The train's cars were less than 10 years old when the shooting occurred, and Donovan says that the cars bear no evidence of the bloodbath that occurred there some 30 or so years ago.
30 years ago, the nation was shocked when a man began opening fire on a Long Island Railroad train. 6 people were killed and 19 others were injured. An hour-long documentary airing Friday on CBS New York takes a look back at the shooting. Here's a preview.
As I think anybody who has lived in Long Island knows, much easier to take mass transportation.
Tuesday night was the night for me to be on that train.
Just made the 5:33 by seconds.
Gas was in between New Hyde Park and Maryland Avenue. That's when the shooting started.
He just started shooting everyone.
I knew I was going to die.
CBS News reporter Carolyn Gussoff produced the 533 legacy of the LIRR massacre. She joins us now from the station where the shooting happened. Good to be with you. Just take us back to the beginning. What was your inspiration to document this shooting?
Well, Catherine, 30 years ago, this community was just shattered by the unthinkable. There really wasn't even a term for it yet, active shooter. I was a reporter on the scene here that night. And in making a documentary, we decided to return to 18 people with direct connections to the tragedy. And all of them, including the jury foreman who spoke to us extensively for the first time, felt that it was simply a matter of having to face the fact that, in his words, we are in a worse place 3 decades later. 30 years ago, on December 7th, 1993, a Brooklyn resident boarded the 533 train from Penn Station. Colin Ferguson opened fire on innocent commuters, killing 6 and injuring 19 of them.
I saw someone get up and take the gun and start shooting everyone from right to left, and it was chaos.
Law enforcement, the public, and journalists rushed to the Maryland Avenue station where the train stopped after 3 passengers tackled the gunman. We came upon a scene of carnage.
And it was horrible. It was a massacre. It's the first time in my career that I actually smelled blood.
The person who committed this crime is an animal who turned that Long Island Railroad car into a death chamber.
He is a fellow by the name of Colin Ferguson.
Ferguson then had the audacity to claim he had fallen asleep and someone else was the shooter. And in his trial, he cross-examined his own victims.
Is it your testimony under Mr. Peck's questioning that you saw no one shot?
I saw you shooting everyone on the train, okay?
Watching the absurdity, jury foreman Delton Dove.
It was cruel and hurtful for the witnesses to look you dead in the face at the person that shot you. So that was really torment.
What took the jury 10 hours to find Ferguson guilty after he was identified by a parade of his victims?
We weren't looking at the clock. Basically, a man's life was in our hands, making a decision whether he should get life or he should be free. And we wanted to make sure that all the victims got their justice.
30 years later, Dove is disillusioned.
We're at a worse place with guns. People with mental illness, getting a hold of guns. There's a lot of anger in the United States, and people are taking their frustrations out on innocent people.
Delton Dove and the others raised some of the most challenging questions of our time. How do we recognize red flags before these massacres take place? And how do we stop the onslaught of violence that has just gotten worse since December 7th, 1993? Catherine?
Carolyn, how did the survivors feel about the gun laws, and has anything changed in the 30 years?
Well, many of them feel a lot of frustration and disappointment, but not universally. One of them, notably Frank Barker, was shot 5 times. He was the father of 7. He's now the grandfather of 19 children. He feels that the problem is not the nation's gun laws. In his opinion, it's mental health that hasn't been properly addressed in 30 years, and the failure to come together to address why we have so much violence in our nation. So, everybody in the documentary speaks out about the fact that it is just time to face how we have not come far enough to address violence in society.
And Carolyn, just final question. You were at the original shooting. You've now had a chance to speak to the survivors, and you've done this great in-depth project. What has stayed with you?
Well, I think that, a massacre, a mass shooting reverberates forever. There are victims, survivors who will just never get over this. But there was also some really life-affirming moments in talking to these 18 people. Lisa Combatti, for instance, was pregnant, 8 months pregnant when she was shot on that Long Island Railroad car. And now 30 years later, that baby that she was carrying is getting married. We went wedding dress shopping with them. So there really are some life-affirming moments. But for the most part, everybody who participated wanted to make sure that the victims are not forgotten, that their names just don't blur together in just a repetition of tragedy.
And that was the long story of a man's short burst of violence that ripped families apart and increased racial tensions in New York and across the US in the 1990s. The victims were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and caught in the crosshairs of an angry man who thought that life owed him. We will ignore this cockwomble and his cockwombleness. This video is of course dedicated to the innocent victims of this tragedy, especially the 6 people who died unnecessarily and senselessly. My thoughts go out to their friends and family, even some 30 years later, because a loss like this never goes away. Thank you for watching another episode of Murder of Crows. I'm Steve. Samson is down here giving me the stares, but he's just slumped out like, I don't know, like what really? You coming to say anything? Come on then. Come on then, come and say hello. And goodbye, in fact. I'm Steve. This ignorant muppet is Samson. And we will see you when we see you.
Say that you're ready, but you won't like it. You say that